I want to begin today with a very direct question. How do you know when you're okay? What is it that you look to or look for to tell you that you're all right? One of the things that we know is that we have these righteous minds and that our minds seek to be in a state of being all right. And so we may look to our social media feed, we may look to our stock portfolio, we may look to the job that we have, the education that we've received, we may look to the accomplishments that we have, the friends that we're connected with. We may look to all kinds of a variety of different things that tell us that we're good. And even your pastor is susceptible to that. When we did the construction and we had to move out of our ordinary spaces and we moved in from the sanctuary into the fellowship hall, we needed a little room that was kind of a huddle room. It was a place, changed clothes in between this service and the one that's before it. And so we need kind of a changing room and a place that if we need to kind of pull together for a quiet moment to make a little mid-course correction, we've got a space. It's not really a room, though. It's a closet. There's no ventilation in the room. It's just through the other side of the kitchen in there. And because there's no ventilation in the room, our hospitality team put a kind of an air ventilation and purification unit in there. And so I remember one of the early days in which I had finished preaching one of the sermon and I went over into the room. I walked in there, and this is what the air ventilator said. I was like, that was a pretty good sermon. Even the air ventilator thinks so. Came back out, preached the same sermon again with feeling, came back in, kid you not, this is what it said. And I didn't have my phone handy, but I promise you, I came in once and it was saying this. The reason that we are doing the disciplines of solitude and silence this month is because we have a tendency to look to the wrong kinds of things to tell us that we're good, that we're okay, or that we're not good. And what solitude and silence does is that it stills all other voices and enables us to seek that God might tell us how we're doing. Over the course of this year, we're looking at a variety of different spiritual practices. And this month in May, we've talked about solitude and silence. In week 1, I introduced the practice of silence to you. And then last week, I introduced solitude. This is the 201 course today. We're merging these two together and talking about what does it look like when they're in action. These two things go together, and they work together with one another. And the way that we're going to do this is through a case study in the Bible, through the figure of this man, the prophet Elijah. And what you need to know about him and every major character in the Bible is that every major character spent time in the wilderness, and that the wilderness time is kind of the picture of what solitude and silence looks like. In other words, Abraham spent time in the wilderness. Jacob spent time in the wilderness. Joseph spent time in the wilderness. Moses spent time in the wilderness. Joshua spent time in the wilderness. Isaiah spent time in the wilderness. Jeremiah spent time in the wilderness. Jesus spent time in the wilderness. The Apostle Paul spent time in the wilderness. So we know that there is something about the rhythm of the nature of the grace that God has given to us that tells us that the wilderness time of solitude and silence is essential for your spiritual growth and the fullness of your life. And so today we're going to look at the prophet Elijah as kind of the quintessential person in the wilderness, and we're going to discover some stuff. We're going to do some stuff. And some stuff is going to happen because of our time in the solitude, in the silence. So let's see this in the prophet Elijah's life, beginning in chapter 19 of 1 Kings, starting in the 3rd verse. And by the way, this outline is in your bulletin, so you can follow along with this. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, and while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord. Here is what you will discover if you spend time in the wilderness in solitude and silence. You will discover that your winning cannot sustain you, that running will not save you, and that exhaustion will eventually catch up with you. Elijah, right before this passage, experiences the largest political, militaristic, and religious accomplishment in defeating the false prophets of Baal. And yet, even though he's on the high of his greatest victories, he learns the same thing that everybody else learns about how lonely it is at the top, and how everybody who has accomplished significant success tells you that they thought there would be more to it than that. And so Elijah's figuring out, he thought that the goal was victory, but there has to be more. Winning can't be the end of the journey. The second thing that Elijah discovers is that running is not something that's going to be able to save him, because there's some things that you cannot run from. I learned this firsthand, and I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I was under the age of 10. And I'm under the age of 10, and we had neighbors who had a large and somewhat ferocious German Shepherd. And I had met this dog on a leash, and I had met this dog through the fence, but I had never encountered this dog in the wild before. This was back my generation. We could actually spend time in the neighborhoods without somebody calling Child Protective Services. We were free-range kids. We actually did this thing called playing in our neighborhoods. And so I was playing, and I was walking towards home when I saw that German Shepherd, and that German Shepherd saw me, and that German Shepherd started running towards me, and I started running away from said German Shepherd. I can still remember the feeling of hearing that I'm screaming, the German Shepherd is barking, and he is scratching my back with his paws. I was terrified. The one thing I knew, though, was that this thing was faster than I was, and that this wasn't working. So I stopped, and I turned around, and I looked at him, and he sat. There are some things that you cannot run. And so the strategy of trying to win your way into salvation or to run your way into salvation just isn't going to work. And what happens when we participate in solitude and in silence is that we discover, like Elijah, there's a point at which you're going to break down, you're going to lie down, and you're going to be exhausted. You probably won't even know how exhausted you are until you get there. Now, one of the books that I've read is called Exhaustion, a History. Most people, when they're tired, they just go to sleep. Nerd alert, I read books about exhaustion when I'm exhausted. And it's not particularly a great book, but I learned something really interesting that I want to pull out of this book for you. So I'm not specifically recommending it. But I like the fact that she chronicles the different way that exhaustion was viewed in different points in history. Because for a lot of time in history, they saw kind of exhaustion as a character flaw. If you're tired, you're doing something wrong. There's something wrong with you. And then there's other times in history where, if you're tired, you're a victim of the system, and that's why you're tired. And then there's other points in history, particularly right now, where being exhausted is a badge of honor. In fact, one of the things that you and I might be afraid to do in today's world is to communicate how busy we are and how exhausted we are, because if we aren't communicating that, it shows how insignificant we are and that we don't really matter. What I'm telling you is all these are wrong. Exhaustion is telling you that something needs to change. That's what exhaustion is. There's something that needs to be done in your life. And usually only when we get still and get alone will we come to terms with that. And so here is what Elijah not only discovers, but what he's about to do in that wilderness time. And it's this: I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, which is another word for Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave, and he spent the night. And so there's some things that you can only learn or kind of discover when you're in the wilderness, and then there are some things that are only the kinds of things that you will do if you're in those periods of solitude and silence. And here's the things that you must do. They're like this: 4 different things. You got to be honest. You got to get back to the basics. You got to let God attend to you, and you need to seek his presence. First thing you've got to do is you got to be honest. Did you notice the language of Elijah? I've had enough, Lord. Take my life, Lord. When I have met with people who are going through despair, this is one of the passages that I often pull out because it helps to demonstrate for people how you can be brutally honest with God. Most of the time when people come to my office to talk about something, the presenting issue is not really the issue that needs to be addressed. I have to get past the stained glass portrayal of what they get to us. And so I ask really important, ingenious questions like, is that all? Is there more? Anything else? And I have to chip away until I can get beneath the surface of how they really feel and what's really going on. So the first thing you got to do in that wilderness time is you got to get honest. Otherwise, this isn't going anywhere. You have to lay before God what is in you, not what you think ought to be in you. Second thing you got to do in the wilderness when solitude and silence is you got to get back to the basics. You will likely not realize how tired you are until you get off the treadmill. And so did you notice that in his exhaustion, Elijah does a variety of things? He sleeps, he eats, he drinks. He sleeps, he eats, he drinks. He gets back to the very basic, fundamental, functional things of existence. And he repeats that over and over again. And then, this is maybe one of my favorite parts of the passage. Did you notice the angels attend to him? That they serve him? I want to show you an image of the inside of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. This is not just any moment. This was this last year at the funeral of somebody you hear me talk quite a bit about. His name's Tim Keller. Can you imagine what it would be like to try to find the preacher for maybe the most famous preacher of a generation? Tim knew the pressure that would be for that moment, so he reached all the way to the other side of the pond to somebody that a lot of people in America didn't know, and had him come to preach at the funeral. Thousands in person, tens of thousands online. I'm watching it in my office. And this preacher reads the passage that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to offer his life as a ransom for many. And he had just a very simple question. Will you let Jesus serve you? Will you let Jesus serve you, or are you too proud? Will you let Jesus serve you, or are you too cynical? Will you let Jesus serve you, or are you too busy that you can't be bothered? Will you let Jesus serve you, or are you too doubtful? Jesus came to serve. Will you let the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, serve you? We will only discover that in the solitude and the silence. And then lastly, we need to seek God's presence. Solitude and silence is not just for the sake of solitude and silence. It's about meeting God. Elijah goes so far as to go all the way to this place. This is a picture I took in Egypt a couple of months ago. This is the valley of Mount Sinai. Those are the peaks of Mount Sinai up there. This is the valley where the Israelites would have been in the time of the Exodus when they waited for Moses from on high. Now there is, for a long time, there has been St. Catherine's Monastery that is here. Do you think that Elijah went here because they have great VRBOs in this region? Looks pretty desolate, right? Why would he go here? This is where Moses met God. Elijah wants to meet God. We can't even be disturbed to try to meet God. People report that they don't go to church anymore because it doesn't fit their lifestyle anymore. Are you genuinely seeking for God? Are you looking? Would you be willing to go out of your way? Elijah went hundreds and hundreds of miles to seek God. So if there are certain things that can only be discovered in the wilderness, and if there are certain things that you have to do when you go through these wilderness periods of time, what can be the result? What can happen in the moment of the wilderness? Here's the rest of the story. The word of the Lord, remember he's in a cave. The word of the Lord came to Elijah in the cave on Mount Sinai. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. Now they're trying to kill me too. And the Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. A great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart, shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. And a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? What can happen? What can happen in the wilderness is you'll finally learn how to get out of your own way. It's not the technical term for the translation in the Hebrew, but you know what Elijah is in this moment? He is a big old whiner. Me, I'm the only one left. There's nobody else, God. I've been really good. Wah. God's like, what are you doing here? But it's only in the solitude and the silence that Elijah's going to get out of the way, his own way. But also, what can happen in wilderness? You can hear God. Truly. I want to show you a picture of Mount Yasur. This is a volcano. It's one of the most active volcanoes in the world. It's been an active volcano for over 800 years. Did you know, fun scientific fact, did you know that the loudest sounds in recorded history are from volcanoes? That they are the loudest parts of creation. I want to show you a famous figure that you might recognize even in profile. This is Will Smith. And I know it sounds like the beginning of a joke, but a rapper, a blind man, and a volcanologist go down into a volcano together. But it's actually true. This was a National Geographic special called Welcome to Earth, and they were headed down into the volcano to be able to explore and record some of these giant silent roars and these sounds. Now, bear with me a little bit for the scientific portion of this. Do you remember when you were back in school and they talked about light waves and that there are infrared light waves? Infrared light waves are a part of the spectrum of light that your eyes cannot take in, that our eyes don't have the capacity to be able to say. We know that they're there, but there's only a limited amount of the type of light that we can see. But one of the kinds of light that we cannot see are infrared light waves. They are too big for our eyes to perceive. Did you know that that's also true for sound? That they're not only light waves that are too big for us to take in, but there's infrasound kinds of waves. So the reason that they took Eric, who was blind, with them down into the volcano is because blind people have honed their sense of hearing in ways that we who use our eyes take for granted and have never developed. And so as they got close to the volcano, Eric reports that he can hear the volcano erupting. He's not hearing it with his ears, he's hearing it with his body. That he can feel the sound waves that are so big that our ears cannot take them in, but he could feel it with his chest. You're probably aware that the moon makes the tides to move, right? It pulls the seas up and down, which is pretty amazing. Are you also aware that the moon's gravitational pull also makes the mountains move each and every day? This is not just true for mountains, it's true for our cities. Scientists have now been able to determine that the city of New York, in terms of Manhattan, moves in a 24-hour period on average about 14 inches a day, depending on the phase, the proximity, and the orbit of the moon. The mountains are literally moving in a way, but you can't hear it. The cities are moving, but you can't hear it because they are sounds that are so big and so deep that you cannot perceive them. Stay tuned for more on this. Here's where this is important. Next month, we're going to talk about listening and discernment. But what you need to know right here is that the Lord was not in the earthquake. The Lord was not in the fire. The Lord was in the gentle whisper, because Elijah's going to have to, like we do, learn what the sheer silence and the still small voice of God is like. That God's not limited to the narrow bandwidth of what you and I can take in with our senses. That God's got waves of the ability to communicate to you and to me beyond our wildest dreams. Last thing here. You can move ahead with hope. Elijah feels like he's the only one left. He's failed. There's nothing else to do. And God's like, this ain't over. You're not the only one. Hey, Elijah, I need you to go back. There's this guy named Elisha, really creative with names, just a different syllable. Elisha, you're going to find him, you're going to anoint him, okay? Then you're going to find Jehu, and you're going to anoint him as well, okay? Because we're not done. Get off your duff, go back. There's still work to be accomplished. Elijah has given up, but God has not given up on them. And I tell you this in part to tell you right now, I know how tempting it is and how often you are willing to admit to me that you've given up. You've given up on your dreams. You've given up on this country. How many of you have given up on America? God has not given up on America. whether you're from the political right or the political left. I am here to tell you, you're not alone. There is work to be done. There is a future. And so God sends them with hope. Back when I was in college, I volunteered for student ministry at the First Presbyterian Church of San Antonio. Volunteering is too strong of a word. You're probably familiar with the phrase voluntold. That's what happened to me. I had a friend who graduated from Trinity, where I went to school, who became the youth director at First Presbyterian Church of San Antonio, and he said, "Rich, I need help with the youth group. You're going to help me." And I said, "Okay." And so Sunday nights, I would go and work with the junior highs and do that at church. And so I would come and I would assist with that. This is before the days of social media, email, cell phones, any of that stuff to stay connected. And I didn't realize that the junior high students and the high school students had a different spring break than the college students. And so unsuspectingly, I show up at church on a Sunday night where there is no youth group. So I make the drive downtown. I go into the church. I'm in this massive building, and there are no students anywhere to be found. I didn't really have anywhere to be, and I certainly didn't have any plans now. So I start poking around the church, and I'm looking around, and I've never been at church before, maybe like many of you, when it was empty. I've only been there on a Sunday morning or a Sunday evening when there was scheduled activities that are going on. And so I'm walking along, I go into the narthex, and I see this sign that I have passed lots of times, but I've never really paid attention to. From the prophet Habakkuk, "Let all the earth keep silence before him." I read this sign, I walk into the sanctuary, I sit down, and the lights are all dimmed. And I just sit there for an hour. I'm not trying to do anything. I'm not trying to accomplish anything. I'm not trying to think about anything. I'm not even intentionally trying to pray in that moment. I'm just still. And in that space, all of my insecurities, all my doubts, all my fears, all my longings, they pour out. And in the midst of the silence, I hear and feel the presence of God say to me, "Rich, you're okay. You're okay. In fact, Rich, because of me, you're more than okay. You're good. And that if you will seek me, if you will pursue me, if you are willing to expand your mind into the adventure of walking into spaces that you never thought that you would go, there will be sounds and echoes of a greater mercy than you've ever dreamed. Some of you think that this invitation to solitude and silence, you're hearing me talk about it, you're like, "That's great, monks do that." No. I'm serious. It's for you. Let's pray. Father, I want to lift before you right now anybody who's still trying to win their way into a great life or run away from that which scares them. pray for anyone who's exhausted. Teach us to be honest, to get back to the basics. And will we let you serve us right now? Present yourself to the person who longs for you here. And in the midst of the solitude and the silence which strips away the noise and the frenetic pace of this world, help us to get out of our own way and to stop complaining and to start listening. And will you enable us to be the kind of community that can move ahead with a hope and anoint the next generation and continue to live out the gospel reality that because of Jesus Christ, we're good. We really are. And this we pray in his name. Amen.